Good morning. If you know me, you know I love history. I like looking at different aspects of history, different events and everything, and it came to my attention that today is actually John Newton's birthday. For those that don't know, he was the man who wrote the hymn that we sang this morning, Amazing Grace. They also made a movie about his life, and it's a rather amazing story. Sorry for the use of the same word again. But this morning I want to talk about two other men who I believe exemplify grace and also mirror some of the ideas and themes in the lyrics of the song Amazing Grace. Before we get into that, let's turn to the Lord in prayer. Heavenly Father, all glory and honor be unto you. We lift you up and praise you and ask that you would open your word to us today, that we would have the ears to hear, the hearts to learn, and the minds to apply it to our lives. In thy Son's name, amen. So the idea of grace is one that pervades the Christian faith. Obviously, it is central to what we believe. The word itself, if you Google looking for the definition of it, there are a number of different definitions, including like gracefulness as far as the way you move and things like that. A grace period when talking about a loan, you don't have to pay it back for a certain period of time, things like that. But the word we're going to be referring to, the definition we're going to be using this morning, is the one that says, in Christian belief, the free and unmerited favor of God as manifested in the salvation of sinners and the bestowal of blessings. Mitsuo Fuchida was born in Japan in 1902. He was raised as a very patriotic young man, or boy and then young man. He idolized the military leaders of recent history in Japan and emulated them and wanted to be like them. So in 1921, he enlisted in the Imperial Navy, worked through all kinds of training and up through the ranks, and by 1936, he had become one of the top pilots in Japan. So much so that he actually trained other pilots in the horizontal bombing technique that he had perfected. Moving up through the ranks, by 1939, he was made the commander of the air group aboard the aircraft carrier Akagi. And in September of 1941, he was asked to help plan, train, and carry out a secret mission in the Pacific. Over the course of the next few months, he helped develop a new type of torpedo to be used in shallower waters, trained many pilots, and eventually on December 7th, 1941, he personally led the first wave of the attack on Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. He was the one who set off the flares, alerting the rest of his wave that they had surprise and that it was time to start the attack. He was the one who personally dropped 2 bombs on the USS Maryland. He was the one who made the Tora, Tora, Tora phrase famous, as that was the call phrase to send back to the Akagi and to the rest of the fleet to send the next wave because surprise had been achieved. He circled above the fight before returning to the aircraft carrier, looking at the destruction the first wave had had, and saw ships sinking, exploding, the mayhem caused by what he had planned, and he returned to the aircraft carrier only to find that his plane had been hit by no less than 20 rounds. It had flak holes all over it, and even the control harness was damaged to the point that it shouldn't have still continued to function. but he had survived. Over the course of World War II, he continued fighting for Japan and went through numerous close calls similar to that. So much so that he even crash-landed in the Pacific Ocean at least once out of fuel, only to be rescued by a Chinese fisherman in a junk ship. Later, he crash-landed on a small, barely inhabited island, only to search for the shore for 3 days, finding that they walked in a giant circle and ended up back at their wreckage. When he finally did find the shore, he was rescued by, ironically, the same Chinese fisherman in the same junk boat. Coincidences occur, apparently. As the war went on, he was aboard the Akagi again at the Battle of Midway. If you don't know what happened at Midway, the Akagi was sunk. Mitsuo Fuchida had had an emergency appendectomy right before the battle and was in his quarters recuperating in a hammock. The Akagi was hit by bombs and was blowing up. The bridge went first, which is where he probably would have been had he not had the emergency surgery. Instead, the side of the ship was blown out where his quarters were, and he was thrown from the ship. Landing in the Pacific Ocean, he broke both his legs, but yet he survived, being picked up by one of the Japanese destroyers within 20 minutes. At the end of the war, the Japanese government and leaders, knowing that they were losing this war, decided they needed to have another surprise attack, and they called on him again. And they were planning an attack that they were calling a suicide mission. You see, they were going to have Japanese pilots parachuted into U.S. air bases with homemade bombs with short fuses, and they were to run up to as many planes as they could and tape the bomb on and light the fuse and run. This is kind of a crazy idea, I think. I don't see how effective that would really be, but that was the plan. And as they were making these plans, they got the group together in Hiroshima. During the planning of this mission, he was called back to Tokyo by his superiors for an unrecorded reason. The day after he was called back to Tokyo, the atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. He missed it by less than a day. We all know Japan lost the war. That was kind of the linchpin to it there, the dropping of the atomic bombs. And Mitsuo Fuchida struggled with civilian life after the war. Thankfully, he had committed no war crimes and hadn't been quite as vicious as others in the Japanese military, so he avoided that entirely and, in fact, was called upon to testify in the war tribunals afterwards. Settled down as a farmer and questioned his entire existence. You see, he was basically an atheist all through his life. The only thing remotely religious for him was the war catechism of the military in Japan. But he had to question, why did I survive? Of all the officers that left the deck of the Akagi on December 7th, he was the only one to survive the war. Of the team that went to Hiroshima after the atomic bomb fell to assay the damage, he was part of that team, and he was the only one to not die of radiation poisoning. In fact, he never had any symptoms even. And he had to question, is there a maker? Is there a divine something out there that brought me through this war? He also, as Japan was making a massive transition from being a very imperialistic, militaristic society to one of peace, as they disbanded their entire military and even agreed to terms that would not allow any Japanese to fly planes in Japan. How do we achieve world peace was his question. How do we make sure Pearl Harbor never happens again? He was already starting to regret those actions. He was already starting to regret what he had done. How do we find peace? How do we get the world to be at peace? That was his question. Well, in order to answer that question, we need to talk about the other man that I wanted to mention this morning. And we need to go back to December 7th, 1941, because it was a turning point in the life of Jacob Deshazer. Jacob Deshazer was born in Oregon in 1912. He enlisted in the military in his mid-20s because there were no real options for him. He had exhausted everything he could think of to try and make a living for himself in the Great Depression. Finally, he determined the military might be the only way for him to get a square meal every day. On December 7th, 1941, he was at his Air Force base in the Midwest. He was too old to be a pilot, but he still wanted to be in the Air Force, so he was a mechanic. The news came across the radio of the attack on Pearl Harbor and of the over 2,000 killed and over 1,000 others injured. 6 ships destroyed, over 200 planes grounded permanently. And he was incensed. He was angry. He threw the potato he was peeling in kitchen patrol and yelled, "You see what we'll do to you, Japs," or something along those lines. He hated Japan from that moment. Filled with a sense of revenge and anger, he took on bombardier training because he thought, I want to be the one to drop the bombs. You see, in the B-25 bombers, which is what he ended up flying on, the bombardiers sat down in the nose of the belly of the plane. Those are those big bombers you saw from World War II that the front nose is glass. And he sat down there and he was the front turret man, and when they got close to the bombing runs, he would actually take over the flight controls of the plane, line them up for the attack, and pull the lever, dropping the bombs. He was approached shortly after Pearl Harbor and asked if he'd be willing to join the U.S.'s secret attack. And he jumped at it, along with 80 other airmen. And they planned out the attack that became known as the Doolittle Raid. They trained at various air bases, trying to figure out how on earth to have a B-25 take off 300 feet shorter of a runway than it's supposed to from an aircraft carrier. They figured it out, and they sent 16 planes on one aircraft carrier to the south of Japan. In April of 1942, their ship was discovered by a routine Japanese patrol, and they were forced to take off a few hundred kilometers further south than they planned to. As they took off from the pitching and rolling deck of the USS Hornet, Doolittle took off first, leading the raid named after him, and almost crashed into the ocean, pulling up only at the last minute. But all the planes were able to take off. Unfortunately, Jacob Deshazer's plane had some damage to the nose that occurred in the pitching and rolling on the deck of the USS Hornet, but he wasn't about to tell anyone. He wanted to make this bombing run. He wanted to attack the heart of Japan because, you see, finally they found out what their mission was. The Doolittle Raid was to take these planes and fly them directly over Japan, dropping bombs on military targets in and around Tokyo. They were taking the fight straight back to the Japanese. This was his revenge. This is what he wanted. So he wasn't about to tell anyone there was a hole in the nose of the plane. Their plane burned fuel faster than the rest, and they had trouble keeping up with them, but they made it. They got to Nagoya, Japan, and they dropped their bombs on fuel depots and on refineries. They then continued on west. And the plan for the entire Doolittle Raid was to land in free China, fly past Japanese-controlled China and land and become part of the American-Chinese co-op Air Force. That didn't work. All of the Doolittle planes, excluding one, ran out of fuel and crashed. But almost all the airmen were able to get out of those planes and survived by parachuting to the ground. Several of them made it to free China or were shuttled out of Japanese-controlled China. Unfortunately, Jacob Deshazer's plane didn't make it as far as the others and was in this heart of Japanese-controlled China. They parachuted out, and Deshazer landed in a cemetery of all odd places. And he was caught 2 days later, along with his entire crew and the crew of one other plane. Jacob Deshazer spent the next 40 months shuttled around between Japanese POW camps, both in China and in Japan. He saw all of the crew of his plane sentenced to death. Although, for some odd reason, the emperor himself commuted Deshazer's sentence to life in prison. But the pilot and the navigator were not so lucky. But they were never even told, it was never confirmed to them what happened to their friends. They just were gone one day. The conditions in these prison camps were atrocious. The Japanese after the war were hit with numerous war crimes tribunals because of the way they treated their prisoners and the way they treated opposing soldiers, even in the fights. You see, it was against the rules of law, or of war. If you shot down an enemy plane and they were parachuting to the ground, you were supposed to give them the grace of letting them land. They would shoot them out of the air as they fell with their parachutes. Just to give you an idea of the mentality of these Japanese airmen and soldiers. There are mass graves all over China that even to this day some people don't know where they all were, where the Japanese would come into a town and behead the entire town into mass graves. The atrocities of the Japanese were only bested by the atrocities of the Germans in World War II, and not by as much as you'd think. And those were the conditions that Jacob Deshazer found himself in. Early on, he was in cells that were designed for maybe 10 prisoners, and they would cram 30 of them in there, with a small, hand-built wooden box as a toilet, and not enough room for more than one or two people to lay down to sleep at any given time. Not that they were allowed to. They were forced to sit or stand upright without leaning for hours. If they were seen to be resting in any possible way, the guards would reach through the bars with their scabbard of their sword and hit them in the head to wake them up, to get them standing up, to get them to stop leaning or resting. They were only fed enough to make sure they didn't die. It wasn't quite enough to keep all of them alive, as most of the prisoners died either from exposure to the elements because it was freezing cold in the winter and burning hot in the summer with no relief, from lack of food, or from the beatings that they took. Eventually, he was placed in solitary confinement. Jacob Deshazer, throughout all this, maintained his hatred for Japan. He was a belligerent, rude, terrible prisoner. Not that I can blame him that much given the conditions, but any moment he could pick an argument with the guard, any moment he could cause trouble for them, anytime he could do anything to make their life harder, he would. They hated him as a prisoner, just like they hated the rest of the Americans. And he hated them right back. Near the end of the war, though, the Japanese, as they started realizing that war crimes tribunals might be coming, they started treating them a little bit better, so they started including bread every once in a while with their meals, instead of just meager portions of rice and beans. And they even gave them the opportunity to request books if they wanted them. Not that there was a light in their cells to read by, but you could, if you held it just right, catch the one beam of light coming through the 9-foot-high window at the ceiling of your room. And Jacob Deshazer, through all this, started questioning. You see, he had been raised by devout Christians, but he did not have their faith. He was an atheist. He did not believe. But he had to question. As he spent year after year in these prison camps, in these horrible conditions, watching his fellow prisoners die, if I die, what happens to me? And he remembered bits and pieces of what his parents had taught him. And when the opportunity arose to request books, the book he requested was the Bible. But being the lowest ranking U.S. prisoner, he had to wait his turn, as everyone else got their Bible first. Well, not their Bible, got to use the one Bible. And eventually he got it, and he was told, you can have it for 3 weeks. And he read voraciously. Every moment there was enough light coming through that tiny window for him to read, he read. And one of the things that he focused on was similar to what Brian mentioned last week with Lee Strobel, was he focused on the prophecies in the Old Testament, and he focused on how they related to Jesus and whether they really were fulfilled by Jesus. Finally, one day, when reading Romans, he read Romans 10:9 that says, if thou shalt confess with thy mouth the Lord Jesus, and thou shalt believe in thine heart that God hath raised him from the dead, thou shalt be saved. And from that moment, he believed. He confessed it. He accepted. He finally understood. Reflecting back on that later in his autobiography, he says, my heart was filled with joy. I wouldn't have traded places with anyone at that time. Oh, what a great joy it was to know that I was saved, that God has forgiven me of my sins, and that I had become a partaker in the divine nature, like it says in 2 Peter. Though I was unworthy and sinful, I had redemption through his blood, the forgiveness of sins in accordance with the riches of God's grace. Quoting Ephesians 1:7. Hunger, starvation, and a freezing cold prison cell no longer had horrors for me. They would be only for a passing moment. Even death could hold no threat when I knew that God had saved me. Death is just one more trial that I must go through before I can enjoy the pleasures of eternal life. There will be no pain, no suffering, no sorrow, no loneliness in heaven. Everything will be perfect with joy forever. I had the promise of being like Jesus, who is God's Son. In that day, I will know all things, for I will then be a partaker of immortality. John Newton's famous hymn, the first verse says, "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me." This story of Jacob Deshazer to me is a perfect example of that first verse, because who is more wretched than this man who was dealing with hunger, starvation, freezing cold cells, and living in his own excrement? I could think of nothing more wretched. And yet at that moment when he found salvation, what does he say? "I was filled with joy, and I wouldn't have traded places with anyone." In that condition, how amazing that grace is. As the war ended, the U.S. troops dropped paratroopers, that's the word I'm looking for, into prison camps all along China's eastern shore. They released the prisoners there, and Jacob Deshazer was able to go home. But not being willing to just go home, Jacob Deshazer enrolled in Bible college. He studied to become a missionary. You see, he wanted to share this grace, this story, this salvation with others. But not just anyone. You see, Jacob Deshazer wanted to return to Japan. He went back to Japan and became a missionary and opened a church, the first church he opened in Nagoya, Japan, the very same city he had dropped bombs on in the Doolittle Raid. During this time, while Jacob Deshazer is going through Bible college and returning to Japan, becoming a missionary, Mitsuo Fuchida has questions of his own, and he is searching. He is trying to find the answers to his questions about peace. He's dealing with the war tribunals, and he's looking at them with a jaded eye, thinking, this is ridiculous. This is just the winners writing the history they want. Because there's no way the Americans treated their prisoners any better than we treated ours. But we're the ones going through war crimes investigations. He was convinced of that. He was certain that America was just as evil as Japan in that way. So he sought out returning prisoners of war, and he found one. His former flight engineer, who he thought had died at Midway. He found him returning to Japan after spending time in a U.S. POW camp. So he sought him out, and he went and he found him and asked him, "How did the Americans treat you?" And this man told him a story of a young woman around 20 years of age who kept showing up at the camps, which were already pretty good. He said he was fed well, the conditions were nice. It was way better than the Japanese camps. But this woman, this girl, kept showing up offering to try and make their lives better. Trying to find out, what can I do for you to be more comfortable here? What can I do to help you out? What is it you're lacking? What is it you need? And these Japanese soldiers were confused. They were, why? We're your prisoners. Like, why do you want to help us? And her story was, because the Japanese killed my parents. Well, it floored them even worse. This is even weirder. What is going on here? And she told them the story that her parents were missionaries in the Philippines. The Japanese controlled the Philippines throughout a decent portion of World War II. But as the Americans advanced, they pulled back and concentrated their forces up in the mountains where her parents were serving as missionaries. They found an American couple and immediately accused them of being spies and sentenced them to death. They were given the opportunity to spend 30 minutes reading their Bibles and praying before they would be killed. And then they were killed after the 30 minutes. And this young woman told them, I hated Japan. I was angry after that. But as I thought about it, and I thought about my parents' faith, I realized there's only one way my parents spent that 30 minutes. They must have spent it praying for their captors and praying for the nation of Japan. And she said, how could I do any less? How could I not show that same love and compassion? How could I not try and spread the gospel to the Japanese myself? And so that's why she treated them so well. That's why she came several times a week to try and check up on them and to provide comfort and supplies and whatever they might need. And through that effort, several of those Japanese soldiers found the Lord, including the flight engineer. This story floored Fuchida. You see, he had been raised a Buddhist and had been raised with the Bushido Code and the War Catechism, and the ideas of forgiveness, they did not exist. You see, in Bushido, it is all about the family's honor. And if someone murders your parents, not only are you justified in going and finding them and killing them, you are actually required to. To restore your family's honor, you were required to kill your parents' murderers. This was the exact opposite of that. Instead, this girl said she was required to forgive them and to love them. It made no sense to him. And shortly after that, as he's walking through Tokyo after being summoned to a meeting with General MacArthur, he happens through a train station. And as he passes through this train station, someone hands him a tract, just a small pamphlet. The name of it was I Was a Prisoner of Japan, written by Jacob Deshazer. He read through this pamphlet and he could relate to some of it, relate to the ideas of hatred for another nation, relate to being a soldier, being a pilot, dropping bombs on the enemy. And when he read the part about Deshazer reading the Bible and finally giving his life to the Lord, it made him wonder about the Bible. And this idea of forgiveness that Deshazer and this woman both talked about made him think about his ideas of world peace. Because if everyone could forgive like that, maybe we could find peace in the world. Shortly after that, he read an editorial in a Japanese newspaper that said that the Bible was the #1 best-selling book of all time. And he thought, I'm getting one. And he read it. And he read the Bible, trying to understand, trying to figure out what all of this meant. And as he read about the crucifixion of Christ in Luke, it opened his eyes. He realized something. And in his own words, he said in an interview later, I read in Luke 23:34 the prayer of Jesus Christ at his death. Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they are doing. And I was impressed that I was certainly one of those for whom he had prayed. It was then that I understood the source of the woman's concern. That very day, I decided to become a follower of Christ. Later, he sought out Jacob Deshazer, and the two of them became friends. In fact, they traveled a few times together as missionaries and preached together to the same audiences in Japan and in other parts of Asia. These two men who hated each other's countries, these two men who brought death and destruction to their opposing nations, became close friends, ministers of the gospel. I think Fuchita's life, while I thought Deshazer's life and especially his conversion mirrors the first verse of Amazing Grace, it is the fourth verse that I think fits Fuchita's life. It says, "Through many dangers, toils, and snares I have already come. 'Tis grace that brought me safe thus far, and grace will lead me home." You see, Fuchita, over the course of the next 25 years of his life, truly believed, and I have to agree with him, that God is the one that brought him through World War II. With all those close calls, with nearly being shot out of the air multiple times, crash landing out of fuel multiple times, being literally blown out of the side of an aircraft carrier by a bomb, and missing the atomic bombs in Hiroshima by less than a day. He believed the divine had to have brought him through that. Through many dangers, toils, and snares, he came and found grace. Grace is an amazing thing. And I heard an acronym a long time ago that's always stuck with me for grace, and it's God's redemption at Christ's expense. And that's what grace is. It is our redemption. It is our salvation being paid for by someone who didn't deserve that penalty. It's our penalty laid on someone else. Neither of these men, sorry, I'm stumbling over my syllables today. Neither of these men deserved salvation any more or less than any of us. But yet grace said, I'll save you anyways. Romans 3:23 through 26 says, "For all have sinned and come short of the glory of God, being justified freely by his grace, through the redemption that is in Christ Jesus, whom God hath set forth to be a propitiation through faith in his blood, to declare his righteousness for the remission of sins that are past, through the forbearance of God to declare, I say at this time, his righteousness, that he might be just, and the justifier of him which believeth in Jesus." You see, these men lived lives that make, I would imagine, most of us look pretty good by comparison. We could say, they were way worse than we are. But that first verse once again says, "For all have sinned and come short of the glory of God." You see, grace doesn't care who you are or what you've done. Grace is there for you, to save you, to redeem you. These men learned that, and I hope that reflecting on the story of these two men and how they relate and interrelate to grace and how their lives impacted one another so completely will be an inspiration to each and every one of us. Thank you.